Okay, folks, just let me get a couple of seconds for people to kind of jump on here. Got a wild, wacky show for you today. It's all good. It's all good. All right, well, let's get this show on the road. Greetings, tech artists from around the world. It's 12:30 and it's Friday. That means it's time for Tech Art Talk Live. My name is Chris, and I'm going to be your host for today's presentation. And for the last handful of weeks, we've been doing this for a while now, but actually, we've been talking about visual effects. Visual effects is a huge category. It's gargantuan. It's huge. It's like, you know what? I'm writing a book on this stuff, and so far I'm a year overdue for the publisher, and so let's just say that they are a little bit impatient. Well, they've been actually very patient with me so far. They're a little bit anxious. But that needs to say, I promised this a year ago, and I'm still kind of like working on it. But hey, lo and behold, things are on the way, and they are working, and things are getting better. So hopefully you will see the book come out in the very, very near future. And you know, if anything today, it is testament that what the topic we're dealing today is itself so phenomenally huge that you could write books about the individual little subtopics inside of that. And what is that, you might ask? Well, we are about to divulge into the wild, wacky, wild west world of simulations. Now, simulations are really awesome, and they are the best way of creating motion. But, however, they do come at a very considerable cost, and they do have their detractions. So there's good and bad points about simulations, and we're going to go into those today. So hang on tight and get ready for the nutty and inspiring presentation for simulations. Okay, let me get my PowerPoint started up here. Okay, boom. There we go. All right, all the power of the universe, but at a cost. Definitely, that's no doubt. Okay. Well, hopefully we are considering that. Okay, hopefully everyone can see this. All right, so as I mentioned before, simulations are awesome. They're very cool. There is no better way of maintaining theme world and story world integrity by creating awesome simulations, because simulations enact the physics of the world, and when the physics work, they make the theme world or the story world itself come alive. It gives reassurance to the audience subconsciously that everything is working as expected. It gives integrity, it gives honesty to the world, and audiences just gobble it and eat it up. And so because they maintain the integrity of the story world, they are an absolute essential component of the storytelling process. Everything has to conform to the physics of the universe. And you, as the visual effects artist, are kind of like playing a godling or a minor godling, or you get to muck around with the physics of the universe and change things around to whatever it takes, but you do it in order to embellish your story. And so whatever it takes to keep that story going, by golly, you go and do it. And that is your responsibility. Okay. Now they're kind of interesting because simulation effects may or may not be part of the rendering pipeline. Now, I had mentioned before that visual effects in its essence is all about manipulating the rendering pipeline. Well, simulations are a little bit different. They may not necessarily conform with that. They may or they may not manipulate the pipeline. How is that? Well, we'll go on to that in a little bit here, because there are various techniques that definitely are pipeline driven, and there are some various significant techniques which are not. And so we're going to explain the difference to those later. And here it is, folks. Because they may not involve the pipeline, which is normally very cheap and efficient, they are very expensive. I'm gonna come right out and say it. It's like if you have to ask how much a Lamborghini costs, you can't afford it. Well, folks, simulations are the Lamborghinis, the Ferraris, your Porsches of the real-time world. They are super duper expensive. And you really got to ask yourself, okay, how important is this visual effect and how badly do we need to simulate it? Because, man, it is going to cost, guaranteed. Okay, now, for the rest of this lecture, I do have to make a disclaimer. The world of simulations is non-petite, in meaning that it is gargantuanly. It is, I call it, infinitely huge. It's the size of the universe, literally. And for every universe and every counter-universe and every alter-universe, there are its own set of rules, and it has its own infinitely set of huge rules. Well, as you can see, physics and simulation is one. So basically, you still want to get your PhD doing computer graphics? Well, guess what? Simulations is still it. In fact, here over at UCF, you can go get your PhD in UCF modeling and simulation program. And then they obviously do more than just make smoke rings and blow stuff up. But this is something that you can still get your PhD on. And where it used to be where people were kind of coming up with better rasterizing algorithms, now folks are coming up with better simulations. Okay, I can't possibly claim to teach simulations in a half hour, let alone an hour. Man, I can't teach simulations in an entire semester or an entire year. It would be too much. However, we can go over the basic fundamentals and the outlines of simulations. And so that's what this lecture is today, is to give you folks a kind of like a rundown and understand what are simulations. Okay, what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to give you a basic introduction of what I thought of the role and foundation of what simulations are good for. We're going to talk about the simulation effects types because there are various types of visual effects types, there are various types of simulations. What we're going to talk about is rigid bodies. We're going to talk about soft bodies. We're going to talk about fluids, which are kind of like soft bodies but different. And we're going to talk about volumetrics. And talk about a doozy, folks. Volumetrics. That's the whopper. Okay, so let's go back and talk to something easy. Let's talk all about story. Yeah, we love story. I love story. Okay, simulations are essential storytelling components. They are the foundation of what makes a world. They are the quote-unquote, the defenders of the suspension of disbelief. Whenever anybody goes into any kind of immersive experience, whether they're watching a television show, they're watching a movie, they're playing a game, or they're jumping into the VR and so forth, they know that what they're immersed in is not real. They understand that it's playtime. They're being entertained, or they're being diverted, or they're into an immersive experience. So therefore, they have to have a suspension of disbelief. Now, the more the story world disobeys the rules of the universe, the harder it is to maintain that suspension of disbelief. Now, if you are playing a game on the Oculus and it has to do about medieval fighting, and then suddenly you hear a helicopter overhead, that helicopter is going to break your immersion. So therefore, the suspension of disbelief has been broken on that situation. Okay, nothing does a better job of holding that suspension of disbelief than simulations. And ultimately, they make the story world feel real. It gives integrity to the world. It makes it feel like it has always been. Okay, this occurs on a conscious and a subconscious level, and so therefore, this is kind of like we're getting back to where the suspension of disbelief is, because even though you know that it's not real, this is going on inside of your head, and subconsciously, your subconscious brain doesn't understand. And the better the simulations are, the more your subconscious mind is tricked into believing this is all real. And it's cool because it goes from the huge movement of galaxies, moving within universe, solar systems within galaxies and systems going on in that, all the way down to things at a microbe level. With all the stuff with this COVID-19 and the simulations going on here, those are simulations, believe it or not. And you are playing around in the microcosmic world. And so those are simulations going down from a microcosmic level. Okay, so it expands everything from the very, very, very small to the infinitely huge. So wherever there's a story, simulations are there, guaranteed. Because ultimately they duplicate physics. Now what we're talking about here are two types of simulation here. We're talking about keyframe motion. Keyframe motion is where we duplicate the physics by hand. That means some animator has to go through and they have to create keyframes and create all of the motion that everyone actually sees. And the other type is computer generated. Now there are a couple types of computer generated. There is automation, and then there's procedural. And I like to think that the big difference between automated and procedural is automated is basically you hit the button and it just does it. But procedural is art-directable, meaning that it involves an artist, it involves an art director, and you've got to put input into it in order to get it made. You just don't hit the go button and it happens. You have to actually provide content to it. You have to provide seed. You have to guide it along its way. But that's why it's art-directable, because that's why it's somewhat predictable. And so therefore, I'm a big fan of the procedural computer-generated simulations, big time. Simulations, in general, generate the effect of forces upon bodies. That's what it's all about, folks. Simulations are just duplicating the physics of the world as forces behave upon bodies. And that's what simulations are. And we're taking a look at as they obey all the way along. Okay, I do have to call the visual effects are the black sheep of the visual effects family. Because the reason why I call them the black sheep is because they don't necessarily always fit in. Now, they may or may not alter the rendering pipeline. It really depends on the situation. Now, if you have the purest, most gosh darn basic, or the gosh darn thorough and realistic of all simulations, then they're going to be outside of the pipeline. That means it's going on and your computer is probably melting because it's working so hard in order to duplicate all the physics that are going on here. But that is entirely outside of the rendering pipeline. You can't take advantage of the GPU. Well, actually you can, but you can't take advantage of it as well. You can't deal with it, but you got to be outside of the pipeline. If you want to do anything else outside but the purest of pure simulations, then you got to involve some kind of pipeline. Now, obviously, the purest automations, the purest simulations are going to be the most expensive, and a lot of people can't afford those. So therefore, you got to start taking advantage of that pipeline again. Okay. Tools for simulations may or may not exist. You may not think, okay, I'm just going to blow something up. And you realize, we don't have the tools to blow it up the right way. Or you might want to do some kind of like volumetric rendering and then realize, yeah, we just can't get the fog to interact with our characters. Why? It's because the tools don't exist. Can you do these things? Most probably yes. And there's some, I pretty much guarantee that there's some mad genius tech artist someplace that's coming up with all these wild, crazy effects, and they're getting it to work, but they are Frankensteining the engine. They are in there doing nutty stuff to it, and so therefore they are doing things that there are no basic tools are going. This is the domain of the real computer geek. Okay, usually in every facility there's some specialist, one person that they lock up in the basement, and they tell them, okay, they throw them Cheetos and Pepsi and say, don't come out until you've solved this problem. Yeah, that's usually your specialist who comes up with all of these wild, wacky, pure simulations. Okay, let's talk about the cost, gang, because come right down to it, all simulations are darn right expensive. Okay, they're expensive in the CPU, and depending on whether your engine supports it, it might be very expensive on the GPU. So therefore, folks, as a general rule of thumb, use your simulations sparingly. And the good way of doing this is to understand your story world contents. Understand how interactive does this have to be? Because interactivity is very, very expensive. So plain out straight, interactivity, big bucks. Now, if you want something to be passive or non-interactive, well, then the cost might go down pretty much. In fact, in some situations, it can go down pretty darn significantly. So understand what your world has to have. What are the must-haves, what are your should-haves, and what would be nices, because a lot of that has to do with how much budget your game or your immersive experience can handle. All right, here I'm going to jump onto my soapbox, folks, and bark at you about my own personal opinion. And this is a little bit biased, so understand that this is my opinion. This is not rule of thumb. This is not the rule of the industry. But when it comes down to simulations, unless someone's life is dependent on it, and believe you me, when you get into the simulation world, when you're dealing with modeling and simulation, military simulations, training devices, lives depend on the simulations, very much so. But unless you're dealing with unless you're dealing with one of these situations of where lives are dependent on your simulations, fake it, ignore it, come up with some other way of duplicating the effect. Don't do the simulation. In my opinion, it's just not worth it. Okay, and the reason why it's just not worth it all becomes a part of this. Human imaginations and human brains are fickle. You like to think that they're logically driven, right? Wrong. Folks. They're not logically driven at all. In fact, 99.999% of all humanity is hardcore emotionally driven. And when they're driven by emotions, how they see the world is dependent entirely on how they're feeling at the time. If they have just been kissed for the first time by the object of their affection who they've been chasing for the last 6 months, they're going to be on cloud 9. If they have just scored really well on a test, if they have just accomplished something really significant, they've just made their first $1 million, they're going to see the world in bright, shiny glasses. However, if they just got a ticket, or if their wedding just got rained on, or if some member of their family just recently passed away, they're going to see the world from a much darker perspective. So it doesn't matter what the simulation is. The simulation is going to get interpreted by whatever your emotion is at the time. So therefore, if you're trying to get any kind of simulation inside of your experience, my suggestion is to strive for what I call as hyperreality. In other words, don't show what is real. Show what what creates the emotion. Show the emotion that people think that they're getting. Focus on the emotion rather than duplicating reality, because as a fact, unless they are seeing something that is at the same level as their emotion, they're going to think the effect sucks. I'm sorry to say that, and it hurts me and it pains me to say that, but people just don't like effects that don't match the emotional state that they're in. So, therefore, create your simulations, keep your audience's emotion in mind, because the emotion really drives how well the effect is going to kind of go over. Okay, now in this thing we're going to talk about the simulation effects types. Now there are basically 4 types of simulation effects. Now the first are rigid bodies, and we're going to spend most of our time here because they're really actually most common and the cheapest of all. And then we're going to talk about soft bodies. Soft bodies are kind of like the antithesis of rigid bodies, because rigid bodies are inelastic, soft bodies are elastic, right? Then we're talking about fluids. Now, fluids is a whole can of worms unto itself. Yes, yeah, and yes, people are still getting their PhDs on them. And then we're going to talk about volumetrics. No, volumetrics. Okay, just wait till we get there. Hang on to your tights. Hang on to your tights, gang. Volumetrics is coming. Okay, so let's go do something easy, right? Let's talk about rigid bodies. Yay, easy. Okay, whenever you hear a visual effects artist say, hey, I blow stuff up, they're talking about, hey, I focus mostly on rigid bodies. So rigid bodies are dealing with objects that collide, fall apart, blow apart, or they interact with each other, all while dealing with gravity. And as expected, these suckers are mathematically intensive. Okay, believe it or not, it's only now that real-time rendering engines are actually starting to integrate real-time rigid body simulations. Now, they could do very, very simple simulations and particles just fine, but when it comes down to the real hardcore, nitty-gritty rigid body stuff, nope. It's only until now that engines are taking advantage of GPU technology in order to take advantage of mega multi-core and AI in order to drive some of these more complex rigid body simulations. Okay, what is a rigid body? A rigid body is something that does not deform or change shape. But wait a second, you're going, hey, wait a second. Everything deforms or change shapes. I mean, even if I have a rock doesn't change shape, right? Well, you drop that rock, it might chip, it might dent. If you have a piece of metal, you know, I think diamonds are pretty hard. They don't, right? But diamond cutters still cut up diamonds, so therefore they do change shape. So ultimately, rigid bodies are not realistic. They don't exist in real life because they're treated as particles. You say particles or rigid bodies? Wait a second, yes. Okay, that's because as this rendering or the simulation or the rigid body engine is considered, it only deals with three things. It deals with the object's position, it deals with the object's orientation, and it deals with the object's radius, and that's used for collision basis. And other than that, it just deals with forces other than that. And so that's what it's dealing at. And so ultimately, rigid bodies are fancy-ass particles. Okay, so we mentioned something about earlier about the rigid body physics engines. And so they all deal with Newtonian mechanics. That's all they deal with. And so Newtonian mechanics can be summed up in 3 sentences. Small sentences, mind you. And the first sentence is, a body at rest tends to stay at rest. Number 2 is, force equals mass times acceleration. And 3, for every action there is an opposite equal reaction. Okay, there you go. There is the contents of the rigid body physics engine. This is what all the engines spend all their time doing. And then they deal with forces applied to those objects. Now, forces are what makes rigid bodies become dynamic. This is what creates, because remember, a body at rest tends to stay at rest. So what you got to do is you put forces onto it, and then those bodies at rest are no longer at rest. And so forces are the catalyst, or the fuel that makes rigid body simulations function. Okay, what do they all look like? They pretty much all look like this. At the top of the loop, the forces are applied to the environment. So all the forces are taken and they're applied to all of the objects. Okay, we're not going to compute the forces. We're just going to take whatever forces there are and we're going to apply them to our objects. And then we're going to update the system. You know, what the new position is, what the new velocity is, if there's been a change in orientation, if there's been collisions, what have you. Then it goes on to the next section where it detects all the collisions. So say, okay, we've got the new positions. Are there any new collisions? Are we in the threat of creating any more collisions? And if it does, okay, then it raises those flags. Says, hey, bub, I've got a collision going on here. Then we got to deal with all the constraints. Now, here's the difficult part, because all the constraints have to be evaluated all at once. And then once all of those have been computed, then it goes ahead and displays the results. After it's displayed those results, then it goes back into the top of the loop again where it applies all the forces that was just computed, and it applies them all again, and it updates the system, and it goes through that loop over and over again 60 times per second. Okay, let's talk about collision detections. Now, collision detections are an important aspect of the rigid body engine where you deal with either bounding boxes, which are nice and simple, and they kind of look like this, of where we've got the bounding box, just surrounded the piggy. It makes it, but they don't make for very convincing collisions because you get objects that don't look like they're hitting to each other, but they bounce off of each other and going, why are they doing that? It's because they are using bounding boxes for their collision geometry. Okay, most probably of what you're used to seeing is collision volumes. Now, collision volumes look something like this, where we have this old man statue, and you can see it is broken up into lots of little polygons and so forth. Now, this gives you the most accurate of descriptions in dealing with collisions. However, once again, it's far more expensive. Which do you think is more cheaper, the little piggy box or the old man dynamic poly meshes? And that's right, folks. The piggy box is much cheaper. So therefore, that's what most people get. Okay. Now, constraints. Now, the constraints are relationships with objects and putting forces on it. In other words, they are the forces between two bodies. And what kind of forces are there? Well, what they actually end up doing is that these constraints, well, ultimately, they restrict motion. They prevent any kind of motion. Whether that motion is translation in the X, Y, and Z direction or rotation in the X, Y, and Z direction, these constraints prevent that kind of motion. And here's the trick. When you're dealing with a rigid body simulation, you've got to take under consideration all of the constraints, and you got to solve for all at the same time. And you wait a second, there's more than one, and what if I have about 50? That means I've got to solve for all 50 at the same time. Yes, you do. You got to all be done. And so that means you've got to set up, you got to make sure that your computer is pretty tight, and it's got to solve a complex system of linear equations. It's got to do it quick. So what are these constraints that we're talking about? What are these? Well, a common thing is our joints. Joints are real common constraints. And things like hinge joints, where they constrain all but one rotation angle. So that means that they turn off all transformations except for one rotational axis. And on the flip side of that are the ball joints, where it constrains only the translations, but it says, like, okay, if you want to do any kind of rotation, you can do that. And then you have your sliders, which does, limits all motion except for translation in one axis. So we go all the way from one extreme, from hinges, all the way to sliders to the next extreme. Okay. Object destruction. Actually, let's go in other words, AKA, let's go and blow some shit up. Okay, so there are 4 steps to doing an object destruction. First, you got to set the thing up. You got to, put the things together. Then you got to create some kind of trigger event. And then once that event has actually been triggered, it's been activated, then you have to carry forth on the simulation. And then once that simulation has been complete, you have to follow through with a resolution. Okay, so let's show some trigger object destruction here. Okay, so here we have our character, and we're inside of engine. And so let's go ahead, and we have this guy moving along. But what if he goes to check out, ooh, look at that, big giant statue. Look, I wonder how he created that. But as he gets too close and he realizes, uh-oh, darn thing fell apart. Okay, we just destroyed that poor statue, and all because of our curiosity. Who's ever gotten thrown out of the Guggenheim Museum? Yeah, you have too? Yeah, that was fun, wasn't it? Okay. But sometimes, most of the time, you can't have simulations going on in real time like that. So what you got to do is you got to go offline. And so that means you've got to go and you got to create these simulations ahead of time, and then you got to bake them out. Now, there's lots of various techniques, but two of my favorite techniques are a thing called octopus animation. Now, octopus animation is basically you create your simulation, you create your rigid body destruction inside of your DCC or your famous simulation engine, and then you run a process on this where you convert the object into a skeletal mesh where each joint represents the centroid of every single object inside of the rigid body simulation. And then when you export, you bake out all of those animation channels for each of the joints. Then you export the skeletal mesh inside of the engine, and then you play it back. And therefore, you play back at the animation, you're playing back a skeletal mesh animation. Now, this is a cool technique, but it's limited by the number of joints. When you start creating a simulation that's, let's just say, maybe more than 200 joints big, then your technical director has a very considerable frown on their face, and then they come and give you a visit and they say, no, this is too expensive. Okay, what's more practical than actually vertex cache animation? Now, this is super great. Now, this is my favorite technique because, plain outright, when you put this in game, it is cheap. It's a lot of time to set up, but it is real cheap because this turns it into a simulation. It turns it into an immaterial simulation. And this is where an imitation, a visual effect, and it becomes really, really powerful. And the cool thing about this is that the real-time simulation that we saw before, where we blew the statue up, it was not controllable. It means it was not art-directable. That means like the physics simulation had to be done, and there's only one way that could be done, and that's the physics way. There's not really much creativity or opportunity to say, well, can we blow it up this way and sometimes blow it up that way? Well, no, you can't do that. You can only simulate one way. So it's not very art-directable. You use something like vertex cache animation, it becomes far more art-directable, but at the drawback of it being non-interactive. Okay, so that is the drawback is, folks, you can't control the interactivity. You guys got to play with whatever you pre-baked. Let's go ahead and check ourselves out All right, there we go. Okay, we're watching Roberto fall from the heavens, and then when he lands, he smashes into a billiard piece. Guess what, gang? This is, there was only about 50 objects that we saw before. There are over 500 little broken piece objects here. And guess what? This doesn't cost anything to play back. Why? It's because it's all happening inside of the material. That means this is all going on inside of the vertex shader. Yeah, that's it. We've got texture maps driving the vertex positions inside of the vertex shader. Really cheap stuff, and it's very effective. And so if we don't mind seeing the same simulation going over and over again, you know, then we can deal with this technique. Okay, so let's talk about soft bodies. Now, soft bodies are realistic, more real critters, where we're actually dealing with deformable objects. That means that they deform shape. That means they maintain the same topology, but their overall shape and the shape or the relative location of the location between the vertices and their orientation to each other, that changes over time. Now, the topology stays the same, but the overall position of the vertices change. Okay, so that means, well, what am I talking about here? I'm talking googly crack here. Okay, well, we're talking about clothing. Clothing is an excellent soft body thing. Okay, we got curves. You know, a lot of times you can animate curves inside of the engine. You've got soft containers. Now, when I mean soft containers, what we're talking about, like pillows and balloons and other soft objects like that. And since we're talking about pillows and balloons, why not talk about organic stuff? You know, we're talking about jiggly. You know what I mean. You know, when I jiggly, you know, we're talking about fat and other accessories. Or we're also talking about fruits and vegetables, and we're also talking about hair. All right, we can also deal with other soft bodies of things like highly articulated objects like ropes, chains, and wires. Now, those don't stretch and bind as much as like the pillows and the jiggly does, but they still are manipulating and they're changing shape all the while. And they could also be used as static extenders. Okay, paper is another example. Okay, if we bold up paper or we crumple paper or we have paper impacted, well, that's a soft body. Okay, ragdolls. Have you ever seen your character die and your character just kind of flops around all over the place? Okay, well, the character itself it's kind of like an integration of soft body and rigid body, where the joints are rigid, or the joint objects themselves are rigid, but they still stay dynamic, and so the whole creature becomes soft, and so it's kind of like an integration of both. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition. Okay, now what's the most common way of dealing with soft bodies? And that is with spring systems. And we've got, if you can imagine, you've got your meshes inside of your object, and in between every vertex and all of its neighboring vertices, it's got a little spring attached to it. And so therefore, what you're doing is a little bit of, I believe it's Planck's constant, and you've got to figure out what the spring condition is for every one of those relationships. So this is kind of like, by default, is an n-squared computation. So that means you have to go through this n-squared number of vertices times. Now, there are two different strategies for solving this abominable amount of calculations. And one is to use Euler's integration, which is kind of simple to implement, but I got to warn you folks, when using Euler integration, watch out, they're very fragile. Now, what most people are transitioning today are using something called Varlet simulation. Now, Varlet simulation by nature are more stable, but because they become more stable, it all has to do with the way that it treats velocity, and ultimately it approximates velocity. So therefore, if you are dealing with a life and death simulation, then maybe you don't want to use Varlet simulation, because ultimately at the end of the day, a Varlet simulation is approximating the velocity. Okay, so let's check it out with some of the spring related. All right, let's check out this flag here. All right, this flag is spring simulated. So that means what I did was I created a bunch of springs inside of a very highly articulated mesh and hooked them up, and then let the system go. It says, okay, system, go ahead and solve for all of those. Now, by the way, in case you are wondering, this is a Varlet simulation. And so we do have some random wind flowing around in here. And if we were to change the wind direction, well, the direction of the flag would change as well. So this is somewhat interactable, and so which is nice. So when we're not dealing with spring systems, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about immaterial solutions. Immaterial solutions seems to be the real go-to when it comes to simulations, isn't it? Okay, immaterials are good fakes. You know, as we mentioned before, it's all performed inside of the vertex shader here. But the things you got to do watch out for is because when you do a soft body simulation inside of the vertex shader, it is possible to do some tearing. And it's great for things like clothing, curves, hair, and foliage. If you've ever seen a visual effect of some foliage flying around in the wind, yeah, it turns out that that's an immaterial effect, and it's just simply duplicating physics. How? It's just passing a little bit of a sine wave through the vertices, and that's all it is. Don't think that that's powerful? Go look at your next game of like Horizon Zero Dawn and look at the environment flying around in the wind. Okay, how is it moving around? It's moving around like a sine wave. If you don't believe me, look at this, folks. Okay, check out this flag. Not a tremendous difference between the other one, but this looks pretty real. Guess what? This is just a single sine wave. That's all right, game. Just one sine wave going through and making that flag. Now, out of context between the two, you know, obviously the realistic spring one ultimately looks real. But if your idea is no attention is to be paid to your visual effects simulation and it's just going off on its own, well, maybe something like this immaterial sine wave passing through your mesh might be just good enough. Okay, and then we're going to go into the offline solutions. And once again, you could do octopus skeletons. But when you're working with soft body, you kind of have to create the octopus skeleton in the reverse order. You have to go in and set up the joints onto the mesh before the simulation. And so what you're doing is you're instancing one joint on every vertex rather on every object instead. And then you create the simulation. And then when it's creating the simulation, then you're baking out the animation into your joint information. So it's kind of like done in reverse order. So that's pretty cool. Okay, and then lo and behold, we have the vertex cache simulation. Yes, vertex cache to the rescue again. And of course, when vertex cache isn't going to do the right, you could always go back to external serialization. Now, this requires typically a little bit more overhead, but if you're got a really fast machine and you can read external JSON files really, really fast, then this technique might be pretty good for you. Okay, let's take a look at a vertex cache simulation for fluid, for the flaw. Okay. Okay, then we have this cloth here. Now, yes, I know I realize that it's rendering backwards and so forth, but what this was is I created this simulation offline, and then I brought this in as a vertex cache simulation, and as you can see, it looks like this thing is actually going to... This is really cool because this can go and create very, very complicated deformations, and it could bring it into real time. In my humble opinion, I think most facial animation, in order to get really high-end facial animation, is going to be done using some kind of variation of vertex cache simulation done in conjunction with the animation that's performed on the face. Just an idea of where things are going in the near future. All right, gang, let's talk about fluids. Yes, fluids by nature have a very, very interesting dichotomy. A pure fluid simulation just by itself is very, very expensive. It's crazy expensive. And as far as I know, no real-time engine can support true dynamic water simulations. And the reason why is that is you got to consider that most visual effects are not supposed to draw attention to themselves. No, if you're looking like at an ocean of water, are you really focusing on the water that much? No, it's got to behave good enough so that you don't draw attention to it, right? And so therefore, you may not necessarily want to really focus on that. So why are you going to focus on something that's really expensive where you don't want people to watch? So once again, you've got to understand the emotional impact of your fluid effect before implementing. You got to talk down with your producer, you got to talk down with your designer and say, okay, what is the real essence of what's going on here? What kind of emotion are we trying to go for? What must we create for this? And what would be good to have and what would be nice to have? Okay, folks, guess what? These things don't exist. I don't know of anything. Maybe some people you do. If you do, please go and call me and correct me, because then I got to make changes in my book. But I'd much rather have you folks come over and correct me if you know of a situation. If there is any kind of real-time true water simulations out there, please go ahead and tell me. Almost all water simulations are pre-generated in somehow. They're either done as material effects, or they're done with spring bases, or they're done with vertex cache, or they're done with ray marching and volumetrics. We'll get to ray marching and volumetrics in just a little bit, so hang tight, gang. Okay, what kind of fluid type simulations are we talking about here? Now we're talking about static fluid bodies. Now static fluid bodies are basically like ponds or even oceans, And what you're doing is you're really only looking at the top surface of the water. You're not really looking at the full body. Now, you've got flowing fluids. Once again, this is like rivers, streams. You're not looking at the water necessarily moving underneath. You're actually looking at the top surface of the water as it's flowing up. And then you have splashes, which, yeah, you're actually looking at the full water body itself. And what you got to consider is, okay, this splashing, this water flowing around here really is going on dynamically, big time. And then, of course, the extreme of that are crashing waves. Crashing waves, yep, those are serious. You're looking at the full-blown, and a lot of times it could be very massive particle simulation here. So, how do you deal with static fluid bodies? Well, in my humble opinion, immaterial packs a big punch. Yeah, that can always go through it. Of course, you could solve it with ray marching, or you could solve it with spring simulation, and you could even do vertex caching. I'm going to still always stick around with my big two favorites. I'm going to go immaterial first, and then I'm going to go vertex caching if all else fails. So what we're dealing with flowing fluids as well. So what we got to deal with is immaterial. And guess what, gang? You can't use vertex caching because vertex caching is limited in the amount of time. You can only have a set amount of time for the vertex cache. So even if it's like for 4 minutes, at the end of 4 minutes, guess what? The vertex cache has got to start over again. So the flowing fluid won't work. But the immaterial will work. And the cool things about using immaterial, you can use things like flow maps or vector flow fields and actually have the water kind of diverge and divest around it. It's a visual effects technique again, but we're talking about visual effects, but actually bends the vertices around some kind of object in order to speed up and slow down the water depending on its behavior. And of course, I have seen some with some spring kind of activity, although they're not typically used because they kind of bounce back into place, right? And so something like propagating sine waves or drop waves through water that's spring-based is usually a thing because there's a problem with the springs returning back to their original place. And then particle systems is an interesting choice, and it's good. It kind of is reminiscent of the old visual effects. How did they create like waterfalls and flowing water, before the days of computer graphics? Well, what they used to do was they used to pour salt on in front of a black velvet screen, and then they would put the camera and they would film the salt being poured and watch the salt pour and tumble down the black velvet cloth. And then they would take that, because the salt is pure white over the black, it was very easy to separate. Though you could take that and put it over the situation, and then voila, they'd have instant flowing water, right? Pretty cool effect. Okay, let's take a look at some of our examples on this. Okay, here's an example of some in-body. Now, this is basically a very, very simple immaterial. This is just a couple of maps, texture maps getting kind of like multiplied against each other. So it's very, very simple. Now here, this is actually going through and using a procedural solution of where we're just propagating some waves in a sine-like fashion, and we're offsetting the waves inside of the vertex shader. Now, this is not colored like water, and it's just to help emphasize and re-show that we're not using the fragment shader like what we're using in here. Here we're using all fragment shader. In this one, we're using all vertex shader. And we're getting all these things by doing nothing but manipulating the vertices and the normals associated with it. Now, if we want to do a combination of both, then we use something like this. Now, these are probably some of the best water simulations. Now, this is what's called a Gerstner simulation. Now, the Gerstner simulations are very effective, and they're probably the best way because what they're doing is they are actually moving the particles around, and they're actually moving the material inside of that. So we can actually see some undulation in there, and we can use all the things like flow maps and vector fields and all those other things in there. So Gerstner waves are really kind of like the best of both worlds. And then we have here is a flowing water. And this could be done, using part of the vertex shader, but honestly, this is just being done with a inside of the fragment shader. Nothing else, nothing more. And this probably works just good enough. If we're seeing this into the background, then it's probably fine, and then we won't have to really worry too much about what we're actually seeing and doing. Now, I don't have any examples for splashes and splats. I just don't happen to have any right now. But some of the techniques you could use for splashes and splashes, you can use flip booking. If you remember last week, we looked at flip booking, and flip booking is a way as you create an actual animated sequence and you embed it into one texture, and one texture can be divided into maybe 64 frames, where each of those frames is flip booked through and the animation is played through on a sprite. Well, actually a splash and a splat can be done pretty well and convincingly using that. Okay, vertex caching. Here we can get vertex caching back again. We couldn't use it for the flowing water, but we can use it for splashes and splats. And a lot of times folks use splashes and splats with decals, especially if it makes like a splat and it leaves a grease stain on the wall. Then when they're dealing with decals and so forth, and the decal can be placed to show you where the splash and the splat have been. Okay, gang, this is the tough one here, volumetrics. I'm going to come right out and say it. This is the wild, wild west of visual effects, gang. If you want to make your name in visual effects and you really want to be a revolutionary and you really want to have a significant impact, you're going to do it here at volumetrics. This is the craziest. There is no standards for it. This is crazy. This is the world run by wild, mad geniuses. And okay, Ryan Brooks, you're out there. You know who you are. Everyone, check out the wild man genius going on here. He's over at Epic Games. He's creating some of these volumetrics here. Volumetrics are the bomb, and the stuff that they're going on with is amazing. We'll be very anxious to see once these actually can make it into tools, but right now this is just wild rootin' tootin' mad genius land here. And so when you're dealing with a volumetric, you got to ask yourself, how interactable does this sucker have to be? Okay, if it doesn't got to be interactive, well, if it does have to be interactive, well, then you could probably get by with particles, sprites, and shaded spheres. It's basically a particle system, a simple particle system, in fact. And the nice thing about that is that these particle sprites and shaded spheres, they can be interactive, they can be art-directable, and they can be customizable. And it's really hard to beat for the bang for the buck that you're going to get. And you can also use particle sprites with texture mosaics. And once again, you could use good old vertex caching, but I haven't seen too many examples of vertex caching looks like really good volumes. It is possible, so I'm just going to put as a sort of right here, because if you're going for a real stylized look, vertex caching, doing a volumetric simulation is pretty good, but for the rest of it, not so much. So what do we mean by particle sprites and shaded spheres? Okay, this is stuff that you folks have probably seen before. This is right from the UE4 default library. I didn't invent these, but here we got some fire, we've got some steam, and we've got some smoke. Guess what, folks? These are pretty convincing. These are nice volumetrics, but they are nothing but particles. And in fact, they're nothing but sprites with flipbooks on them. And they're just played forth, and they are pretty cool, and they are art-directable. But you got to watch out. They do get a little bit expensive because they're dealing with a lot of transparency. And the transparency gets expensive over time because, well, transparency is just kind of expensive in the rendering engine because you got to render out all of those layers and then blend them on top of each other. But needless to say, even though these are expensive, they're still not nearly as expensive as true bloom volumetric simulations. Okay, a lot of times folks do their volumetrics in the post process. Now, these are familiar devices that you may have taken for granted, and we're going to herald back to the lighting, because this is kind of like where things herald back from where we first started. And you might see something like height fog, sky atmosphere, light shafts, and other things like that. And so you can get some pretty interesting looking volumes, especially mists and clouds and smoke, especially into the distance, using nothing but post-processing, and it is very convincing. It's very effective. Okay, gang, I promise you, here it is. We're going to talk about ray marching. Now, I could create a book just on ray marching alone itself. It is like super cool. Ray marching is like one of the most cool techniques you ever want to do. Okay, folks, if you know your HLSL or your GLSL and you really want to show your talent off as a shader writer, show a ray marching. You got to do it. Ultimately, what you're doing is creating the entire universe inside of the fragment shader. That's all that there is. So ray marching is kind of like a baby cousin to ray tracing. It's faster than ray tracing. It's simpler than ray tracing. But it's not actually ray tracing. It's something called sphere tracing. So that means, like, as you shoot your spheres into the scene, it does nothing but tell you whether your distancing to a volume is there or not. And then once that sphere bounces back, it doesn't come back with any light information. It just comes back with the distance information. And that's really all that it's sending out. So you can see it's kind of like ray tracing, but a much more primitive and simpler version. Okay, now we're going to start dealing with volumes redefined here. Now, this is where things are getting interesting, gang. Because when you're working with ray marching, then you got to deal with something called constructive solid geometries. So that means forget about creating your geometries with meshes and polygons. Like, you're going to create CSGs. And your CSGs are kind of like volumetric abstract definitions of what shapes are. And we might actually have a separate session just on what CSGs are, just for TechArt Talk Live, because it's such a cool topic. But anyway, a signed distance field does nothing but tell the sphere marcher, am I inside the volume? Am I on the volume? Or am I inside the volume? Inside, on the surface, or outside? One of those three, and that's all it's telling you. Not a whole lot of serious information. Where can you possibly use this kind of thing? Well, you could create static solids for it. You could create deformable surfaces out of it. You could do liquids, and you could use it for other volumetric phenomena. And honestly, this is where you're going to see most of the use for ray marching is inside volumetric phenomenon, because there are better ways of creating static solids, deformable surfaces, and liquids than using ray marching. Ray marching is kind of like using an atomic bomb to kill a rat. Is it really necessary? Maybe not. You have to consider like how much things are going. Oh yeah, gas, mist, fogs, vapors, you name it. Okay, but here's the interesting dilemma, folks. And this is why I don't want to dismiss it, but this is the ways why I'm still embracing it, and I'm going, oh, this stuff is so cool. Okay, because the future is unknown, right? And I don't know what's going to happen. And we've got these mad frickin' geniuses like Ryan Brooks over at Epic, and a whole bunch of other people who have more brains inside of their pinky than I have in my whole body. And they're working on this problem. But I have a hunch that this is where things are going. Now, we don't know where it's going, but I have, ray marching is really, really good for numerically imprecise phenomena. Remember I said, like, the ray does nothing but tell you if you're inside the volume, on the volume, or outside of it? One of those three things, because that's pretty imprecise. Ray tracing needs to be very right. But when you combine ray marching and ray tracing, oh my gosh, gang, guess what? This is the future of modern rendering. Okay, when you combine ray marching and ray tracing, then if you're using ray marching to do most of the heavy lifting and you're using ray tracing just to do the very fine precision stuff, this is where power things really start kicking in, because that means that you no longer define scenes with polygons. There are no longer any vertices. There's no longer any meshes. We're no longer dealing with this. We're dealing with creating the scene in volumes. Now, if you've ever worked in ZBrush, you already are kind of like working in volumes with that in kind of a realistic stuff. But imagine creating entire worlds out of that way. So that means subpixel geometric information. So that means you could get information down to the subpixel level. And that's where this definition is going to hold true, because we don't really know about it. We just need to care about the volumes that are defining it. And we're going to use ray marching here to kind of like make it cheap. And you can get infinitely complex detail, and as much detail as your creators can put into this. If people say, oh, this is great, because I'm not going to have to deal with UVs and texture mapping information anymore. Ha ha ha. Guess what, folks? If we get rid of the UVs and the texture mapping and so forth, guess what? You're going to have to make that object look good from 10,000 feet, from 100 feet, from 5 feet to 5 inches. And all of those, the object is going to have to look good. Your work is going to not become easier. It's going to become harder. It's going to become much, much more difficult. Okay, so where are we going into the future? You know, I don't know. If you have any things, if you have any ideas, you have any concepts, I'd love to talk to you about them. And, you know, the more we talk about this, the more we'll be able to flesh things out. But, you know, this is where I think we're going to abandon all rasterizing rendering. And we're going to go to defining entire worlds inside volumes and going with full-blown ray marching and ray tracing to render everything. And I think that's where we're going. But if you have any other concepts, please share your thoughts with me. Let's have a discourse about it. I love talking about this stuff. All right. Folks, thank you very much for allowing me to indulge inside of my simulations passion. If you like what we're talking about, check us out next week, because next week, that's 5/21, we're going to be talking about particles. Yay! When you're talking about visual effects, people think about particles. Yay! When they think about tech art, they think about tech artists. What do tech artists do? They do particles, right? Okay, what have I been talking about? Here it is. We've been on over a year. And have we talked about particles yet? No, we're going to deal with particles next week. Okay, you know, to celebrate 1 whole year of Tech Art Talk Live, we're going to talk about particles. Yay, it seems only appropriate. Okay, folks, if you like what you saw today, go ahead and subscribe. Go ahead and press that darn little button in the lower right-hand corner. Go ahead and subscribe to us here, or subscribe to check out myself. I'm Chris Rhoda. Check me out on Facebook and on LinkedIn, or check out TechArt.edu, also on Facebook and on LinkedIn. And otherwise, check out TechArt.edu. Go check out the website, and if you can, opt in and give me your email address, and I'll make sure that you get sent updates as things go along. Like I said, we've got a book coming out. We've got a couple books coming out, and we've got changes coming along for TechArt.edu that are sure to deal and impress. So thank you very much for joining me today and allowing me to indulge into my thoughts and my crazy concepts dealing with simulations. And I look forward to sharing particles with you next week. And until then, have a great week. Bye. Arrivederci.